What makes someone American? Or better yet, what makes someone feel American, or Canadian, or French, or Pakistani? What gives us that feeling of connection to others that share our national identity? And for different nations, it can be a number of different things, and that's what we're going to explore right now. So, if you haven't seen part 1 of this video, we gave an overview of what it means to be a nation and a general definition of nationalism, right? So a nation is a group of people that share a connection or invisible bond with each other. And nationalism is that desire for that national group to want to have some control over their own destiny. Here, we're going to look at some of the different factors that can create that national identity. The first one we're going to look at is language. And in some cases, having a shared language, shared vocabulary can be a very powerful building block of nation. For example, I'm a Polish speaker, and if I'm riding the train, riding the bus, and I hear somebody speaking Polish, even though I have no connection to them at all aside from that, I still feel a little bit of that connection with that person who speaks the same language as me. And for some nations, again, that can be a very powerful building block. That can be very true for stateless nations as well. In Canada, people of Quebec see themselves as a separate nation in a united Canada. And them being primarily francophones is an important part of that national identity. Another factor that can help build national identity is ethnicity. So the ethnicity of you, your ancestors, be that Norwegian, Japanese, can also play an important role in creating that sense of national identity, especially in more homogeneous nations and nation states. Another important building block of national identity is culture, and history plays a really big role in this one as well. For example, the English-speaking world, right? Lots of different countries around the world have English as the primary language, so we can't really say that that might be an important building block there, but these countries share very different histories, or have very different histories, right? In the United States and Australia, for example, both English-speaking nation states, but have a very different history that might play into their national identity. Right, on a different scale, in Canada, different First Nations groups, be it First Nations of the coast or First Nations of the prairies, have different traditions, different languages, and all of this plays into a different national identity. Another important building block, for example, is religion. So Jews, for centuries, didn't have a nation state to call their own. Now Israel exists, but until Israel was formed in the mid-20th century, Jews lived all over the world and continue to. But part of that national identity comes from their religion. And historically, religion was one of the things that bound Jewish people together as a nation. In the world today, nation states are also in some ways created around religious principles, religious beliefs. Places like Iran, Pakistan would be examples of Islam being a very powerful sense of national identity that is created. Geography can be an important building block as well, especially when geography serves to isolate people. And so national identities can grow differently than that of the people around because of that geographical isolation. Tibet is an example of that, where people in Tibet have a national identity different from the Chinese on one side, India on another side, and so on. And that geographical isolation of being surrounded by mountains played a major role in that. Another major one is the relationship to land. And for example, the indigenous people of North America, of Australia, have very spiritual connections to the land that they inhabit, that their ancestors inhabit. inhabited and plays a major role in their way of life and that identity that's created as a result.
In the story of the Blackfoot people, published by the Glenbow Museum in Calgary, Alberta, the Siksika authors describe this connection to the land of the North American plains and its impact on their nation's identity. Our sacred sites are places where significant things happened to our ancestors. This is where ancient stories took place. These sites are uniquely important to us. They tell us that our ancient stories are true. They tell us that we belong to this place in a way that no other human being can. Our sacred geography shows us our path through life. By following this path, our people will live long and productive lives.
In a different way, relationship to land plays a role in the Middle East, where through the religious history, both Palestinian Muslims and Israeli Jews have a relationship to the historical land of the Middle East and of the Levant. And that has caused some conflict over competing claims over that land over the last many decades. Another important one is the ability of politics to create a national identity, especially when it comes to political change and overthrowing one form of government into another one. And this is one that we saw in the French Revolution, where that desire to create something new really bound French people together and ended up overthrowing the monarchy. And we see it especially in revolutions in modern days as well. And finally, there's this idea of a civic nation. And this one in some ways is related to politics, but it's for nations and nation states where the other building blocks don't really work, mostly because of the diversity in those nations. And so this really plays a major role in places like Canada and the United States, where it has to do with the reason why people come to these countries to begin with. That protection of freedom and civil liberties and our government systems of liberal democracy. These are the reasons why people come. And in places like this, it shouldn't matter what your religion is or what your ethnicity is, right? Some of these other building blocks that we talked about, it shouldn't matter what your background is because we protect and we respect that diversity in our Constitution, in our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and so on. And so places like Canada and the US, our national identity kind of continues to evolve. And that definition of nation in places like this continues to grow over time as we become more diverse and so on. And so countries like that almost fit a special category of nationhood as civic nations. And that begs the question of all these different building blocks of nation, well, which ones are most important and how could they lead to clashes? And especially when one nation's source of national identity might not be the same as others. And what happens when one group's, even within a nation, one group's understanding of their history or heritage might be different from another. And how might that cause conflict? And what are some of the steps that might be taken in order to try and overcome that? We're going to keep looking at some of these challenges that nationalism creates as part of part 3 of this series. And thank you very much for watching. Subscribe to make sure you don't miss anything in the future, and see you again next time.